Welcome to the screencast for Meditations on First Philosophy by René Descartes. That's a picture of him over there in the corner. Before we start, I'm going to give you a little bit of background. So far, we've looked at the writings of contemporary philosophers and their specific writings about epistemology. So now we'll take a look back at someone who's often claimed to be the father of modern philosophy. And if we think about all the other stuff we've read, we'll see shadows of his influence on their work. So he was born in 1596, so his work had to be pretty influential to make it all the way down to us. And he lived and he worked during a time of immense socio-political change. He was born in France. The Enlightenment was beginning, which is sometimes called the Age of Reason. So if you don't know much about this time period, this is right when science was starting to separate from philosophy and become its own thing. People were looking to reason and to evidence and to what they could learn from the outside world in a way they never had before. Prior to this, I've mentioned before, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in this lecture, people were interested in the outside world, of course, but the guiding bodies of knowledge that came down through the ages were Platonic from Plato, Aristotelian from Aristotle, and from sacred texts from the Abrahamic religions, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So the Middle Ages was spent melding these topics all together and trying to provide a rational basis for morality and how we should live, all guided by faith. And this was a time of upheaval, where people thought we should rely on our own reason to get to knowledge. We should break away from faith. Not that we shouldn't have faith, but that when we want to get knowledge about the outside world, a different kind of methodology was needed. And he was a philosopher, and he was a mathematician, and he was a scientist. So what we're going to read today, the Meditations on First Philosophy, and we're going to read the first meditation, is probably Descartes' most famous and influential philosophical work. But it's far from the only influential thing he produced in his lifetime. So he came up with the Cartesian coordinate system. So, you know, the way we can graph any function with an x-axis and a y-axis, he was the one that came up with that. So he made important contributions to mathematics as well and to science. He began writing this work in 1639 in his 40s. So it wasn't done when he was a younger man. It's a series of journal-like meditations. There are 6 of them in total. We're only going to look at the first 2 in this class, and only the first one today. In a few modules, we'll come back and look at the second one. And like I said on the last slide before, for nearly 2,000 years, all of intellectual and academic ideas and everything that human knowledge consisted in began with this kernel of ideas that Plato and Aristotle had figured out all the logic, and our sacred texts told us how to live, so we need to merge those 2 things together, and that's where we get knowledge. That was epistemology, or the study of knowledge, for nearly 2,000 years. So this hybrid compendium of knowledge, Plato and Aristotle on the one hand, sacred texts on the other, was known as scholasticism. And Descartes studied all this stuff for decades, and he rejected a lot about it. It was the modern turn, is what we call it now. He rejected 2 specific things. One, the idea that the physics of the universe, so the way the actual physical universe works, he didn't think it could be described by idealized and abstract forms, which is what Platonism and Aristotelianism said about the external world. And We don't have to go too much into what they are, but the general idea is that there's some abstract divine concept of every single thing that exists on the earth, and we're all just rudimentary copies of this ideal form. And Descartes rejected that. And Descartes also rejected the idea that all knowledge comes from sensation of the outside world. So we talked about empiricism. If you're an empiricist, you think all knowledge comes from the outside world, and he rejected that. Instead, he thought that we could get knowledge of the outside world using reason and our minds alone. So now we're going to start the meditation itself. It starts on page 94. And Descartes, like I said, was very well educated. He had a very comprehensive general education. So he'd read a lot about a lot of different fields. And when he looked back on the history of ideas in scholasticism, he saw that there were a lot of contradictions and confusion. There were points that people had argued on for hundreds of years and never come to a conclusive idea about. So he asked himself the question, which should be really familiar to us now. A lot of our authors do this. How can we tell the true things from the false things? And he wanted to wait to do this until he had a mature mind and some time to himself. In reality, it took him about 2 years to write the Meditations, but he styles it in the work, and it's pretty slim volume. And he says he writes it as if he wrote it 6 days in a row consecutively in a cabin by himself next to a fire. So this is the setting. This is him starting his meditations about knowledge. And the first thing he comes up with is that, well, if we really wanted to figure out which one of our beliefs are true and which ones are false, we could go through every single one and test them. But that is not practical. There's no way that we'd ever be able to get through all of the millions of background beliefs that we have about every single topic. So what would be a more practical methodology? How can we get to the root of all beliefs? On page 95, he says, "Reason now leads me to think that I should hold back my assent from opinions which are not completely certain and indubitable, just as carefully as I do from those which are patently false." So I'm not going to agree to any opinion that's definitely false. That's the second part. But the big claim here is that you shouldn't agree that belief counts as knowledge if there's any doubt whatsoever that it could possibly be wrong. So think back to the scientific method and inductive inferences. All that's doubtable. So we can't be certain about it. We can never be certain that we have all the information. And this is key to Descartes' motivations and goals for the entire Meditations. He has this really insanely high standard that you can't count something as knowledge until you can never doubt it, until it's absolutely certain. So he wants to come up with a methodology to ensure that all knowledge, all human knowledge, is built on a firm, certain, undoubtable logical ground. So now, in order to do that, Descartes will look at and categorize all the different types of beliefs that we can have. Because if we don't have the ability to go through every single individual belief that we have, there must be types of beliefs, different ways that we gather knowledge that we can test out and see if they are certain or if they're not. Can we reasonably doubt them? So his method of doubt is the way he does it. It'll lead eventually to the skeptical conclusion that there's not much that we can't doubt. Don't let the first meditation confuse you, though. Descartes overall is not a skeptic. He is a firm believer in science, math, and technology, and humankind's ability to understand the external world. But he thinks that we'll never get to real knowledge unless we stop relying on the scholastics' doubtable claims and we find something with a certain foundation. So he'll consider in turn beliefs that we get from the senses, beliefs that we get from logic and reason, beliefs that we get from the Christian God, and beliefs that we could get from a powerful entity interfering with our perceptions and our reason. So these are the way that he categorizes how we can possibly get knowledge from the outside world. So first he thinks about our senses. And he says, I'm immediately aware of my body. I'm aware of it because of the sensations I feel in it, and I can see and hear and smell and taste and touch what's immediately around me. So how do I know that the information that I get from my senses is a good, firm, certain, undoubtable base for beliefs and knowledge? First, Descartes talks about so-called madmen, and this is on page 95. He says, how could I deny that these hands or this whole body are mine? Some madmen think that they're kings or they're paupers or they're dressed in purple when they're naked or that they're made out of glass. So we know that sometimes people's senses can even screw with how they have knowledge about their own bodies. We can also think about optical and auditory illusions, like the one on the top right over there. The horizontal lines are parallel, but we cannot get our eyes to see that. So that's an instance of our senses letting us down, our senses being doubtable. We also hallucinate sometimes from drugs or from illness, or even when we're just really, really tired or desperate, like in the case in the bottom right of a mirage of water in the desert. So our senses sometimes fail us. And if they sometimes fail us, Descartes thinks, they are always doubtable. We can never be sure whether or not they're failing us in any given time and place. Then he also thinks about dreams. Sometimes they feel absolutely real while we're dreaming. He goes one step further and he asks, what if we've been dreaming for our entire lives? Our entire life is a dream. So we normally think we can tell the difference between wakefulness and the dream state when we're awake, because the dream state is fuzzy or clouded, or we can control it with lucid dreaming. But what if those two states are just two states inside a larger dream? So I talked about the matrix in an earlier screencast. Now we can talk about inception. It's possible that our entire lives have been a dream. So we have to discount everything that's come from our senses. Our senses are doubtable, they're fallible, they make mistakes all the time. So we have to doubt everything. And that means that you can't even trust that you have a body. You can't trust that you have hands that have 5 fingers. You just can't be sure because your senses could be lying to you. So if we stick with this thought experiment and we concede for the time being that we've been stuck in a lifelong dream, that nothing we think has really happened to us actually matches the external world or the way the world really is, we can notice that there are some things that hold true even in dreams. And the first thing is that 3-dimensional space still exists. So I have the top right picture to help you understand what that is. Our entire universe that we can perceive is 3-dimensional space, but that's a function of our experience. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not doubtable. In dreams, we still have 3-dimensional space. We still have objects, and that's the middle picture, that have a shape, and they are solid or not solid. They take up space, they're in motion or they're at rest. That still happens in dreams. And time still passes in dreams. So here we have 3 things, 3 categories of belief, and we have to figure out whether or not they're certain, whether or not we could reasonably doubt them. So we have three-dimensional space still existing, basic shapes still existing, the rules of logic still exist. So the law of non-contradiction just means something can't exist and not exist at the same time. Basic relationships between distance still hold, and that's like 1 + 1 = 2. So maybe we've gotten to something that's certain. He gives us this list. Corporeal matter still exists. The three dimensions, the shapes of things, the fact that they have a quantity, which means their number. They have a size, and time still exists. But Descartes thinks we can still reasonably doubt even the most simple, largest categories of the universe, experience, and knowledge. And his answer as to why we can doubt it is God. So philosophers in this long history with the scholastic philosophers came up with a slightly different concept of God than the one we might be familiar with from religion. There's a lot of overlap, though. They spent centuries blending logic, reason, and scripture. Their faith was always an anchor for human reason, but they thought human reason was a gift from God. They thought being able to understand the world was the way in which we were made in the image of God. So they wanted to be able to interpret their articles of faith in the most reasonable way that they could, so they could live good lives. But one thing that overlaps between the philosophical conception of God and the religious one is that God is omnipotent, omniscient, eternal, and omnibenevolent. So that means all-powerful, all-knowing, eternal, straightforward. Omnibenevolent means all good, no bad characteristics. So because God is all-powerful, if God wanted to, it could manipulate our minds and our experiences to make us believe absolutely anything. God is all-powerful. So that includes the fact that maybe there's no three-dimensional space. Maybe the real world outside of us has 20 dimensions or no dimensions. It includes basic math. It includes logic and reason. God could just be putting anything he wants into our heads. So we can doubt even logic and reason. We can doubt three-dimensional space. Every single bit of experience is doubtable. Descartes realizes, though, excuse me, that since God is omnibenevolent or all good, it doesn't seem to follow logically that he would deceive us so thoroughly and completely for all of existence. Deception seems like an inherent bad, so it couldn't be a quality of God's. But Descartes gets around this by thinking of an evil demon that isn't as powerful as God, but is still really, really powerful and can interfere with our experience. So if this demon is just at the level underneath God in power, all of experience is still open to doubt. No bodies, no images, no objects, not even space and time are left undoubtable or certain. So we are in quite a bind. Nothing we've ever believed so far meets this really strict standard of certainty. And it looks like we've gotten to this skeptical conclusion where we can't believe anything counts as knowledge whatsoever. But if you want a little preview of the second meditation, one of the most famous phrases in philosophy, I think, therefore I am, is the thing that's going to solve the skeptical dilemma for Descartes. But we'll worry about that when we get to it. So as always, please leave comments and questions below the video if you're confused or you'd like more detail on something.